Accuracy is a huge topic in identity, and there are massive inaccuracies out there, but it's not a deterministic versus probabilistic equation. The most optimized balance between having scale so that advertisers can reach, their audience and, publishers can monetize their content, but scale combined with accuracy. That is the rule of the game here, and how can we push the limits there?
This week on Next in Media, I spoke with Fabrice Beer-Gabel. He's the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at Intent. Fabrice and I talked about the state of identity in 2026 in the face of the cookie apocalypse that never was, and this renewed push for deterministic IDs, just as AI threatens to upend the whole system. Fabrice and I even got into whether brands are leaving money on the table right now by not getting their identity house in order. Lots to get into, so let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Next in Media. I am Mike Shields, and my guest this week is Fabrice Beer-Gabel. He is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at Intent. Hey, Fabrice, thanks for being here.
Hey, Michael, thanks for having me here. It's great to speak with you.
Lots of stuff to get into. I think it's probably a good place, and this will be an easy one to start with, because I think folks will know Intent, but not everybody will know the specifics. Maybe just give us a little bit of what Intent is, a little bit of the backstory, if you would.
Sure. We're really a deep technology company focused on identity resolution. We've been inventing a lot of technologies in that space and helping publishers as well as advertisers break through identity silos in a universe that is increasingly fragmented and has idealist environments. We're helping advertisers, ad agencies, publishers better monetize their inventory or better reach their target audience.
Okay. And there's a lot to dig into there. Obviously, a lot of pieces. Give us what has changed. Like in the last couple of years, we sort of went through this big period of anticipation and all these macro changes, and some were calling for Armageddon. What has really changed, and what hasn't when it comes to like mobile identifiers, cookies? Like, how do you kind of sum up the state of affairs right now?
I like to talk about the challenges breaking through silos. We got a world. There's not one world of identity. There's tons of signals. And whether you look at different media environments or different geographies, just the signals vary. And the ability to keep an identity continuum becomes increasingly challenging. We call that kind of new universe idealist, even though it's all about preserving the continuity of identity across all those fragmented silos. And that, I think, is the symptom that we're seeing over the past few years. It was before that all about cookies are going to go away until, Google kind of set the tone
right
with a new direction. And now, people who think the cookieless world, quote unquote, is not relevant are actually misled, because what is happening is a very fragmented audience and identity universe.
Right. That only got more complicated. It wasn't as though we thought a switch was going to be flipped. It didn't, back to normal. It wasn't like that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, 150 plus million iPhone users in the US, that's madeless mostly.
Yep.
Browsers are cookieless. You got 70 million desktop browsers that are cookieless. You got CTV environments that work different types, signals. So preserving that identity continuum across those environments is a real challenge.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of how we will preserve that, I think at one point there was thinking, and maybe this is still true, that rather than preserve, we would have a replacement. We would create a new alternative that everyone would use, or most of us would use, whether that being a LiveRamp ID or UID. Then there was thinking, well, maybe we won't do that. We'll do cohorts. Then I think today you're hearing a lot more about, okay, we've got to use deterministic identifiers, and that's it. So that's a lot there. But where have things evolved, and are any of those paths the right one?
Yeah. On the debate between deterministic and probabilistic, that's an interesting one. A probability can be 1%, but it can also be 99%. There's tons of cases where deterministic technologies are less accurate than probabilistic ones when they steer towards the 99% as opposed to being 1%. So accuracy is a huge topic in identity, and there are massive inaccuracies out there, but it's not a deterministic versus probabilistic equation.
It's not as one is perfect, one is eh.
No,
That's not the state of affairs at all.
no, no, no. The rule of the game is to striking the most optimized balance between having scale so that advertisers can reach, their audience and, publishers can monetize their content, but scale combined with accuracy. That is the rule of the game here. And how can we push the limits there?
Okay, talk about, if you could, mobile, because I think the mobile industry went through it. It was where it was a much more abrupt change. You talked about being made lists, and the predictions were pretty dire in terms of what you were going to be able to do at some point. How does that look different now? How has mobile maybe steered its way through that? Has it looked different than the rest of the web?
There's a lot of similarities in a sense, where mobile environments or mobile app environments have traditionally used what's called a MAID, a mobile ad ID. And whether you're in Android or Apple environments, those IDs take different names or different shapes. In a sense, what you still have is a third-party identifier, one that follows the user across all the apps. And you have identifiers of the first-party type that only are limited to the user within an app or within a publisher of apps.
Right.
You have the same thing in browser environments. You have what's called the third-party cookie and the first-party cookie. So those same parameters play in both the mobile app environment as well as in the browser environment. They just evolved at different paces, but today those fragmentation are there in both environments. Add to this that besides, in addition to privacy regulation, you have, some of the big vendor-owned policy. Apple came up with ATT.
Yep.
App tracking transparency. Then there's different ways those first-party IDs benefit one company versus another. Apple has had some issues with the way they handle it in Europe, for example. So all of these are just contribute to creating this very fragmented environment.
Yeah. You mentioned regulation. I was going to ask you about that because I think from a U.S. perspective, it's sort of been hard to read where the current administration is going, where things are going to change or not change with various states. I think it's more. You operate in lots of different regions where the rules are maybe more clear cut. How do you explain the differences and how do you navigate that very muddled landscape, to say?
It's a very tricky path to follow, and it's critical to follow it right. There's no messing around with privacy regulation, and it's another piece of the fragmented universe in identity resolution that is happening today. You mentioned several states in the US. Obviously, Europe and GDPR have their own, approach. And any media buyer or any publisher, whatever they do, must stay attuned and have a stack that's agile and able to maintain privacy compliance with all of those. It's tricky. There's a lot of these. We, as a identity, specialist, we have to absolutely support every single one of them. And we have to follow very closely how they evolve, what they require, and make sure we comply with all of them.
So you don't just pick the strictest standard and say that's what we're going to do everywhere. That doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because it obfuscates traffics unnecessarily, and it limits options, and it gives a disadvantage to companies that compete in that space for reach or for monetization. So, but you do have to comply with every single one of them. Even GDPR has different flavors. In each country, there may be a regulatory body that has their own view on those
their own interpretation of these things, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, why don't we take a step back? Give us some, if you can, some examples. Like, who are some of your partners, and what might be a way that they use your technology?
We have two primary lines of business, if you will. On one side, we help sellers, companies that may be publishers, monetization platforms, or SSPs. We help them identify that unidentified traffic because of signal constraint environments.
So these are companies that don't have a million login users, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Companies that don't have logged in users And users who come to their sites or to their mobile apps or their CTV apps without being identified through a typical standard third-party signal. And so we work with, some of those partners. We, talked in the past, companies like Raptive, for example.
Yeah.
Or some SSPs, and many others in the mobile world. We've been working a lot with a company called Bid Machine. So these are two examples. One is more web, the other one's mobile app. But in both cases, the massive issue here is that there's a ton of traffic and users and audiences that are unidentified and therefore under monetized.
They're perceived as less valuable, or they're maybe treated as less valuable because of that.
Absolutely. And through a solution we call bid enhancement, we're able to identify those audiences in a way that's privacy compliant and accurate, which is, again, one of the major issues in our industry today. And then in turn, we are able to bridge the gap of this identified user with the existing available demand, which today is primarily based on cookies, actually. And that immediately improves monetization for publishers and for those monetization, platforms and sellers. On the more buy side, on media and advertisers and ad agencies, the flip side is that advertisers struggle to reach their target audience in those signal constraint environments.
Outside of the walled gardens, right? Like
outside of the walled gardens, that's right. Outside of the universe where users are logged in. And, we just announced a partnership with Horizon, the largest independent, ad agency. And similarly, the goal is to help amplify data and data signals so that they can actually reach their desired and target users or an advertiser's targeted users within those environments. Think of Apple users that are typically known to be, more affluent, potentially desirable for advertisers. But in many of those environments, even though this is privacy compliant, the signals may not allow proper addressability. And we're helping those, media buyers, advertisers, restore that identity continuum.
Do you think, are we seeing, I don't know if I'm simplifying this too much, but almost like there's an arms race going on where you have, the Amazons and Google's out there talking about, we have bazillion logged in users, we have a deterministic, and then most of the big agency holdcos have either made acquisitions or they're building out their own identifiers or identity spines. Are those two things in conflict? Are there always going to be just different factions and you kind of help connect all the dots? Like what do you make of that landscape?
We're in a world of outcomes. There's more and more pressure for outcomes. That outcomes create competition. That drive for outcome creates competition. And in the case of ad agencies that you brought up, but everybody has to differentiate and build differentiation. In the world of ad agencies or advertisers, it comes a lot from the data and the knowledge they have about their users. Eventually, that data and that differentiation needs to translate into the way they reach, they target users, they activate, they buy media, they measure performance. And it resolves down to an identifier. Now, you have identifiers that are used for those spines just as an aggregator of data, insights, and measurements. And you have identifiers that we call biddable. Biddable identifiers are a specific beast because they bridge between the supply side and the buy side. So while ad agencies, advertisers may have their own spine, because that's part of building their differentiation in terms of retaining their data and understanding better their audience, they need to bridge from those spines to biddable identifiers.
It's one thing to measure, it's another thing to have a transaction.
That's right. And the biddable IDs are the ones that enable the transactions.
Right.
Like, we have one. We have one that we call IIQ ID. Because we work with both sellers and buyers, we're able to have an identifier that lives in the bid stream.
Yeah. Okay. I got to ask you, of course, about AI and how it's changing things. There has been some talk about whether, that identifiers won't matter as much when the platforms know people based on their behavior better than even the marketers, which there's definitely debate about that. Do you see? But then there's also talk about like us heading towards more predictive ad buying. How do you see the use of AI changing things right now? Things playing out.
It's huge. It's huge. AI has a huge impact on our industry. And in that sense, we have been using AI for years and we continue to do so. And we could not do what we do without it. It's so fundamental in the ability to process massive amount of data, drive insights out of it, and being able to act, fast. So in that sense, AI is essential. It's now also affecting the way consumers access content. I think tying this back to identity, there is, in terms of infrastructure, again, it's fundamental to use it. You cannot, get scale and accuracy without using it right. And in terms of the way consumers change their behavior, identity remains an essential point in enabling re-engagement. The place of intent may happen maybe in an LLM or in some kind of chat environment. But once you've detected intent, how do you follow on? How do you follow through the engagement, the dialogue with that consumer?
Right. That is not the only place that person's going to spend time or be amenable to ads.
Exactly. And identity is key to all that.
So are you feeling like there's definitely a lot of pushback in the industry or presumed pushback that this idea that you're going to just give all your money over to the two platforms and they'll kind of know how your data is being used in the plan. It sounds like that brands don't want to give up that kind of direct relationship. Are you seeing that?
Absolutely. They don't want to give that up. They want to, retain control over their differentiation, their core assets, their core audience relationship. But, consumers have a say in this, of course, and they go wherever they want to go. And so there is strong demand for interoperability and transparency across the ecosystem. I think walled gardens are seeing this, and even though it's not their core business is to protect their own platform and their own data.
That is their
I
asset.
think we're seeing more opening in enabling kind of interoperability, recognizing that consumers don't go to one place, they go to many places. Advertisers need to retain their differentiation. And as there are more alternatives, I see an opening. I see a more openness than there was before.
Where are you on? There's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm around the potential for Agentic to really change programmatic advertising. Then there is, I wouldn't say there's pushback, but there's some thinking that maybe we got to see, that we got to be cautious here or see how fast we can move. Where are you? Are you seeing experimentation there? Are you bullish on that?
I think this is something that has its own pace. It's not something that we're seeing, right away. Take a very significant impact in our industry, but it's something that people are experimenting with and watching closely. I think from what I'm seeing, people are more concerned about making sure that their core asset, which is their content on one side or their audience on another side, are protected and that they are able to preserve that value even as new consumption models emerge. And that is, I think, a pretty big deal that we see more in the US right now, less in Europe at the moment. But, someone was saying that for every single visitor to a site, there are 200 crawlers on that site. Those 200 crawlers are, non-ad monetizable environments. If this situation doesn't land on a sustainable model,
it's not good for a lot of us.
Yeah, exactly. So I think these are the primary issues right now that we need to tackle.
What about, does it, like I always think of the worst case scenario as a long time journalist, like what are the dangers with Agentic in terms of like identity protection, data protection, things going wrong? Should I assume that security is just, inherent, or is there things to worry about?
Unfortunately, right now, there are very significant issues in terms of identity accuracy in our industry. And it's something that we should be opening up to a bigger, broader debate. That is a major issue, and that can potentially cause a lot of people to think they're targeting or they're investing in certain areas or in certain reach or targeting, and actually that's not what's happening. I think that is a big issue in our industry that needs to be opened up further, and for people to better understand what their identity is actually providing them, really.
Okay, so the more that AI gets used by brands, I wonder if they assume that this will sort of fix any inaccuracies in their data that they employ. But what are some of the dangers there, maybe?
Yeah, there's indeed. Well, so the AI models are basically using, training data sets and expanding them. The more accuracy you have in those training data sets, the more amplified they're going to be. Basically, AI is amplifying what it's being fed. If it's fed inaccuracy, it's going to create even more inaccuracies. So it's very important. In fact, it's putting emphasis on being accurate in what we do, especially in terms of identity and identity resolution. Accuracy is going to be more and more important as AI gets more and more used.
Because I imagine undoing those mistakes will be really challenging.
Well, it will be. I mean, it may not be notified. That is the problem. And then you end up having AI can create scale. But if it doesn't come with accuracy, then you're going to have inaccuracy at scale.
I wonder if you get some advertisers asking, like, why is this so important? Like, isn't inaccurate data just like, we don't care about those users anyway, or it's not, it's the price of doing business. What do you see there? What do you say to them?
Well, I tell them that I totally understand that they live in a world of outcomes increasingly, and they have to deliver results. And identity, in that sense, needs to deliver results. Ultimately, the right identity resolution can double their reach, or the right identity resolution can, increase bottom funnel performance by 80% and increase conversion rates and increase, ROAS. And the same way for publishers, the right identity resolution lifts their ad revenue by 30, 40, 50, 60%. We have to tie everything to results because that's the world we live in right now. We have to deliver outcomes.
So yeah, if you don't get this right, it's not just a waste, it's leaving money on the table.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I guess lastly, do you have any advice for brands right now who are maybe they're probably worried they're racing towards using more AI. They're probably cautious about wanting to give away too much of their data or help models, get trained on their own insights. And they still want to make sure they're targeting their customers that they care about. What advice might you have for marketers right now?
I think, more than ever, it's a life lesson. We must be agile. I don't think there's I'm not reinventing, inventing the wheel here, but the world is changing very fast, and being agile means being able to experiment and doing our best not to get ourselves locked into one thing, because that thing is likely to change. And if we're so dependent on it, then we're going to get stuck. So experiment, remove your single points of dependency. Yeah, that would be, my kind of general lesson here.
Don't get comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Fabrice, fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for your time here. Let's chat again down the road here.
Sounds great. Mike, thanks so much for this.
Thanks again to my guest this week, Fabrice Beer-Gabel of IntenIQ. If you liked this week's episode, please take a moment to rate and leave a review. We have lots more to bring you, so please hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time for more on what's next in media. Thanks for listening.